In this short PowerPoint video, we'll be going over civil liberties, freedom of speech, and the press. Thank you for your time and listening here today. Freedom of speech and the press. Freedom of speech and freedom of press. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Freedom of speech is the liberty to speak openly without fear of government restraint. Here are some relevant court cases that we will be going over today. New York Times v. Sullivan, Tinker v. Des Moines, Miller v. California, and Brandenburg v. Ohio. In this slide, we will be going over the Brandenburg v. Ohio case. In this case, the petitioner was a leader of a Ku Klux Klan. He was convicted by the courts after a television news report was aired, broadcasting speeches made by him. He was charged with violating Ohio's criminal syndicalism statute. This means that the arrest of the individual was unlawful and not within the rights of the law. Ohio's criminal syndicalism statute did not draw a distinction between teaching the need for force or violence and preparing a group for violent action. Hence, the statute unconstitutionally intruded on the rights of the U.S. Constitution. In this slide, we will be going over the court case Miller v. California. The facts of this case are that Miller, after conducting a mass mailing campaign to advertise the sale of adult material, was convicted of violating a California statute prohibiting the distribution of obscene material. Some unwilling recipients of Miller's brochures complained to the police, initiating the legal proceedings. Is the sale and distribution of obscene materials by mail protected under the First Amendment's freedom of speech guaranteed? The court held that obscene materials did not enjoy First Amendment protection. In other words, the Supreme Court reaffirmed that the holding to be obscene and is not protected by the First Amendment.
New York Times versus Sullivan. So in 1960, New York Times published an article in which they claimed Alabama police was wrongfully treating the student protesters, and this article had a lot of inaccurate and false information, and L.B. Sullivan, he was a commissioner of public affairs, and he thought it reflected on his reputation, and so he decided to sue the New York Times for libel, which is a big. And the Alabama court, they sided with Sullivan and fined New York Times $500,000. So New York Times, they took their case to Supreme Court, and they said it violated their right as a freedom of press. So this case, New York Times versus Sullivan, it was mainly about freedom of speech and press. And as the New York Times claimed, it violated their right as a free press because the First Amendment protects the free speech, and it allows the press to criticize or say anything about the local officials or government. And so in this case, Sullivan, he sued New York Times because they published a false article about him and his department. And yes, you can sue press if they release a false or misinformation about you, because First Amendment doesn't. It only protects you from the government that you can say you want, but it can protect you from a lawsuit where you where you publish false and misleading information about a official or a person. So the court they sided with the New York Times because they gave the chance to Sullivan to prove that New York Times knew that they were publishing a false article or they were using misinformation, and he had no way to prove that because New York Times didn't know themselves they were publishing a wrong article or wrong information. So it eventually ended up on the New York Times in New York Times' favor. So yeah, at the end, it was a really important case in the history and regarding the First Amendment for freedom of speech and freedom of press. So in this case, New York Times were just doing their job as a press and giving out the information what they received. Yeah, it was wrong, but they didn't know themselves because there's a lot of misinformation or conspiracies about everything. So yeah, it played a really important part. Tinker versus Des Moines High School case. Another case we have. It was extremely influential on First Amendment and a right of free speech. So on December 16, 1965, 15-year-old John Tinker, 13-year-old Mary Beth Tinker, and 11-year-old Hope Tinker, and 8-year-old Paul Tinker and their friend Christopher. They all wore black armbands to the school to protest with ongoing Vietnam War. So, in response, school they warned them that they have to take it off because they viewed it as because they said it was disrupting the school activities and creating a different environment. So, so they told them to not wear that, but they continued to do that, and they were suspended from the school. So, as a response to the suspension, Tinker family sued school district as with the help of Iowa Civil Liberty Union. They suggested Tinker family to sue the school because they can't do that because that's their First Amendment right. Students have the First Amendment right. So as the case went to Supreme Court, they voted in favor of Tinker family because they decided it was pure speech. It wasn't hurting anyone or wasn't creating a threat. So it was a pure speech, and students have their First Amendment right just because they're in school. Doesn't mean they don't have it. You know? So I think this case played a major role in our as a First Amendment right, and I think it paved the way of for a new generation as like a national school walkout. To I think it was it influenced a lot of students and sets an example to to practice their First Amendment right.
So the next case we'll go over is Texas versus Johnson. So what happened was that outside of the 1984 Republican National Convention in Dallas, Texas, Gregory Lee Johnson burned an American flag because of protesting. He got arrested and was charged with violating a Texas statute that prevented the discrimination of a respected object if such action were likely to stir up anger in others. And by burning an American flag, you get a lot of backlash off of it. He argued that his actions were symbolic speech protected by the First Amendment. Symbolic speech being that of like non-verbal, non-written forms of communication, such as like flag burning, wearing an armbands, and burning of draft cards. The majority of the court agreed actually with him and held that flag burning constitutes a form of symbolic speech. So the next case after that is the Roth versus United States. So along with the Alberts versus California case, it was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court which redefined the constitutional test for determining what constitutes obscene material unprotected by the First Amendment. Obscene material like things that people find offensive or they just don't like in a strong manner. Samuel Roth of New York City was convicted of mailing obscene materials. He operated a book-selling business in New York, and he was mailing like obscene books, and that violated a federal obscenity statute. He was found guilty by the NY jury for violating the law, which was the Comstock Act, and the Comstock Act of 1873 made it illegal to send obscene, immoral, or indecent publication through the mail. But the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the NY state's court decision, which was mailing obscene materials did not violate the First Amendment, because obscenity is both worthless and sexually lewd.